So I'm going to introduce this tour, the Guide to Walden Pond. There are 15 stops in 4 basic areas. The first domain up here, I call it the Northeast. It's our world of modernity, of parking lots and visitor centers and roads and beaches and an artificial beach and all of that. The second one over there in that corner of the pond is Thoreau's world. It's the historic 19th century world where he lived and wrote Walden. The third quadrant of the pond is down that direction, and there are 4 coves: Ice Fort Cove, Sandbank Cove, Deep Cove, and a buried cove you can't see. And so those are like the points of a star, so I call that part Walden Star. You can hear the railroad coming by right now in that part of the cove. And that's the biggest, deepest part of the lake. And then the last part I just call Southeast Reentry. After the tour that we're going to take, we need to spend some time in our own heads thinking about what we've learned before we return back to our world of modernity and back to the visitor center. Pan that direction and you will see swimming beaches and stone walls and lots of sand and a house and benches and stonework and more stonework and more stonework. All of this was created during the 20th century. This is Thoreau's description of what this place was like when he first got here. The shore is composed of a belt of smooth, rounded white stones like paving stones, excepting 1 or 2 short sand beaches, and is so steep that in many places a single leap will carry you into water over your head. Now, I assert that that is not what this looks like. It is a broad, broad, broad sandy beach built to hold tens of thousands of swimmers. And this brings up the #1 issue about diversity with respect to Walden Pond. It's trying to do 2 very, very different things and unify them in a single agency: the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The goals of conservation can be opposite the goal of what? Conservation and recreation? In other words, is this a community bathtub or is it a sacred site where somebody wrote a book that changed the world? Which is it? The deed restrictions in 1922 that said you need to maintain this as the world of Emerson and Thoreau. In other words, that's a condition of the deed. I don't think they've met the condition of the deed. So let's go have a look. Okay, talk about diversity. Every single stone here is different, and yet we can group them into categories of stones. For example, granite, gneiss, slate, amphibolite. And so what we can see here is sort of an archetype granite stone right there. And this is a much darker stone from a more mantle-derived rock. Something like basalt, but it's granular. We might call it gabbro. More granite. There's a really odd bent and folded rock. This is I don't even know what they are. You have to break them open to really see what they are. But that's conspicuously different, not a granite. Something much finer grained. And here we have synthetic stone right here. This is basically a ceramic pipe. And this, of course, is the concrete, which is a synthetic rock that isn't that different from some rock. Interestingly enough, when Thoreau lived here, he hardly ever came over here. He hardly ever came here because it was a challenging walk on steep hillsides. There was no trail. That trail wasn't cut until the 1930s. And that was cut only to sort of get people away from being mob seen on the eastern shore. So it was a challenge for him. If he came to the eastern shore, which he did, all right, he came either by boat or on the ice, most times. I don't know of a single record where he walked the walk that we're gonna walk, okay? Walden Pond doesn't hold water. It exposes water. In the same way that if you're at the beach and you were to go down on that flat sand above the shoreline and dig a hole and you find water in the bottom of the hole, you're exposing the water that's there in a layer. Now here, this is the surface of the water table. The lake surface is the surface of the water table. It's truly a well, as Thoreau described it, a deep and green well. It exposes water, it doesn't hold it. And so basically what happened here is that there was a flat gravel plain, and then there was some buried ice under it. And as that buried ice melted, the surface began to cave in, and it was initially dry. And as the ice at depth melted more and more and more, the surface became a kettle hole because it's dry. But as it kept deepening, it eventually intersected the water table. And when it did, it became a kettle pond, because that's the word we use to describe a water-filled kettle. The signage at the visitor center is wrong, okay? Kettle holes are dry holes, and we will see one here. Kettle ponds are places where you see perennial water. Kettle pools are places where you see seasonal water. And many vernal pools in this area are kettle pools. Oh, the pine pollen. Now this is the pond path. Very narrow, hemmed in by rail fences. It's a cut and fill structure. You have to excavate the bank on the right in order to make a flat spot, and you use that excavation material to fill the left side. You see how that works? So it's a cut and fill structures like many roads through unconsolidated materials. One thing I want to show you is just how steep the slope is here. Now imagine that you've got all this deadfall. Imagine Thoreau walking through here. It's a real ankle twisting walk because it's very steep and it's full of deadfall. And the trees also fell off into the water line. So he had to wait until the water was low to make pedestrian access around the pond. Under normal conditions, he would not have walked this. And here's another one. These are erosion control, runoff control devices. Notice we're in a swale between the water rushing down here in this direction and the water rushing at us from that direction. So this is where they're guiding it down. It's like a downspout or a gutter on a house. Or we're standing in the gutter and that's the downspout. And here's some failures. See how that slope is caving in right there? It's pulling away from us. This was not meant to be. Bear Peak, right up there. The reason Thoreau called it Bear Peak is because it was bare of trees at the time. And that's because it was clear cut. The trees were growing back during his era in the 1840s and 1850s, but by the time 1918 rolled around, they were cut again, because there's a photograph of Herbert Gleason from another Bear Peak. And since then, it's grown back again. Okay, so the key concept here is to think about this is not a forest that's been here forever, it's a series of regrowths, one of which was in the site of Thoreau's house, okay, where the trees were only about 20 years old. I mean, he's literally building his house out of trees that are his age because they were previously clear cut, 20 years earlier. So the reason we call this Bear Peak is because it was Thoreau's favorite observatory. And if you can imagine him standing up there, he would be looking out over the largest of Walden's three big basins, the Western Basin. It's the deepest and largest and best. And his world was about the Western Basin. It was not about the eastern part that we came from and began. And it wasn't about the central part. It was mostly about this Western Basin. So we're going to be looking at a series of stops in Thoreau's world, beginning with Bear Peak. The next one is Thoreau's Cove. The next one is going to be Wyman's Meadow. The next one will be the house site itself. The next will be the bean field. And the last stop in this group of Thoreau's world is going to be what I call the waterfront. he called it his pond side. So we'll take in a series of stops in this northwest quadrant. Now, one thing I want you to do is take a look at the slope. Pan the slope from the top of Bear Peak all the way down to the water line, and then it continues below the water line. This is one big, great collapse slope, okay? This is what happens when you make a sinkhole. The side slope flow into and cave into the sides of it. And if it's made of sand and gravel as opposed to rock, you don't have any juts or eminences or irregularities. You simply have a smooth, sweeping slope all the way down to the bottom of the kettle. That's what we have here. That's what Thoreau means when he says that the shoreline is so narrow that at times you could basically, jump, just jump to the bottom of the pond and you wouldn't even know it until you came back up the other side. It's a very unusual lake, and Bear Peak is the best place to show the idea that this is a talus slope, a collapse slope, something that writer Stegner called an angle of repose. Okay, so there you have it. Now let's look over in here. Two other things here. Now we're looking down that steep slope, and you can imagine on a sunny day the water takes on a turquoise green color and then a deep green color. That's all about the optics of water. That if you have dissolved organic substances in water, the deepest color you're going to get is a bluish green, a deep bluish green rather than a blue. Okay, so he was right when he called it a deep green well. Thoreau, as we know, was a genius. He worked out a mathematical formula to predict the width or the depth of a cove and the shape of a cove based on 5 or 6 measurements. I mean, it's just amazing what he's able to do, to develop what he called a formula. So he understood that these coves, the star points on Walden's star, okay, have a different origin from the main part of the center basin. They are also collapse slopes, okay, but they're collapse slopes that are modified by sort of groundwater seeping. And at the same time, they're different from that really deep central basin where the meltout was like a piston, being drawn straight down, to bedrock at depth. It's no accident that Walden Pond is the deepest lake in Massachusetts, okay, at 102 feet down to the muck and another 20 feet or so of muck itself down to the basin that was here when it was a glacial kettle originally. So this is Thoreau's Cove. It's one of 5 coves on the tour, 4 of which we'll visit because the last one is submerged. The pond rises and falls, but whether regularly or not and within what period, nobody knows, though as usual, many pretend to know. The pond has risen steadily now for 2 years, and now in the summer of '52 is just 5 feet higher than when I lived here in 1845 through 1847, or as high as it was 30 years ago in the 1820s, and fishing goes on again in the meadow. In other words, Thoreau would take his boat from the waterfront and he would take it right through an isthmus here, and he would just paddle into open water here that was a 4th basin of Walden Pond, and he would fish in there. And the fish were excellent because it's a nursery for fish, because it's protected, and also it's the most ecologically rich place in the entire pond path. Most of the Walden Pond path is pretty much a, sort of an oak, pine, hickory mix that's grown back since the 19th century. And there's a lot of invasives in the underbrush, and there's a lot of, it's a pretty dry, pretty sterile soil, but this is not. It's a deep pool, a deep marsh. It's very, very rich. And so this is the chapter in which I featured the descriptions of the present ecology, based largely on work by the park staff. And you can see the pine pollen on it. The interesting thing here is that I never stop observing. The pine pollen is creating a film on the surface that, under the right lighting conditions, looks like a mist, but it isn't, okay? And if we go into Thoreau's Cove, we don't see it on Walden because the body of water is big enough to have access to the wind so that the pine pollen is washed against the shore in a film. In his journal, Thoreau comments on giant heaps of pine pollen, you know, that he has to step over in order to get to shore on the eastern beach. And the interesting thing is that pine pollen is now the second, I believe it's still the second most common nutrient of phosphorus into the pond after human urine. So human urine in the summer is number one. Number two is pine pollen, you know, degrading as a source of phosphorus that creates turbidity in the water by allowing the growth of sort of microalgae. As we begin walking up the hill, we'll probably see some erosion of the trail caused by surface runoff. This exposes small patches of reddish-brown rusty sand with the texture of granulated sugar. This is the brand new accessible trail. What I really like about it, crushed granite. Crushed gray granite. This belongs here, not bluestone crushed stone dust. You know, over by the visitor center, if you look at what that is, it's crushed something else. This is crushed granite. That's what Walden is made of. Please read Walden. Count the number of times he uses the word house, count the number of times he uses cabin, and then look at the context the way he uses the word cabin. There's only one that is ambiguous about him referencing his house as a cabin. All the rest are houses or metaphors. We want to think he's building a cabin. We still want to think he's getting away into the deep woods. We think he's trying to get away from society. That was not the point of his coming here. It was to live in the netherworld, on the edge between the flat plateau of normal reality up there and the secluded pond, or the secluded hollow that he's living in here. He's on the edge. Back on. Before steam drilling, which came in the late 19th century, cut stone was called hammered stone because it was cut with a hammer and chisel, usually by unpaid or low-paid workers to create monuments to the wealthy and powerful. Thoreau was very clear about his preferences in Walden, and I quote, "Nations, including Concord in his century, nations are possessed with an insane ambition to perpetuate the memory of themselves by the amount of hammered stone they leave. More sensible is a rod of stone wall that bounds an honest man's field than 100 gated Thebes that has wandered farther from the true end of life. Most of the stone a nation hammers goes towards its tomb only. It buries itself alive." This is hammered stone. Bronson Alcott, in his writings, said Thoreau would not have wanted hammered stone. And Thoreau considered Bronson to be sort of his philosopher, his wise man, his oracle. And Bronson knew better than to do this, yet somehow this happened in 1948, I believe, is when it was installed. Very importantly, Thoreau is hoeing beans. Morning after morning after morning, 7 miles of beans, working from 5 a.m. till noon. And every morning, look what he has to do. To get to his bean field, he goes up. He has to walk up and out of this depression. Over there in that direction, Thoreau's hand-planted and hand-cultivated crop of white bush beans, he demonstrated to the community how farming should be done. The length of his rows totaled 7 miles. The patch of excellent soil he chose lies at the same level as the visitor center. So what I want you to focus on here is how flat it is. We can pirouette 350 degrees and see nothing but flat. And the only thing that isn't is the trail that leads down to his house site. This was the carriage road down to Walden Pond. The picture is from May Alcott. She's the only one that caught Thoreau at Walden Pond. She sketched it from memory because she came here with visits for him, and I'm sure he was tons of fun. And he's rowing his boat. And you can see that his house is up there, stylized as if it were on top of a cliff. But it's actually, if I remember the book right, 432 feet away from his house site. He did not live on the edge of the pond. He came down through the trail that we walked on to get to what I call his waterfront, which is stop 10. From this waterfront, Thoreau enjoyed water views, watching wildlife, dipped his drinking water, and went boating, swimming, and fishing on land owned by Cyrus Hubbard, not Emerson. His house is on Emerson's land, but his Walden water activities, which is the point of the book, take place on Cyrus Hubbard's. From this shore, the western basin of Walden appears roughly circular with points. Deep Cove over there has a star point. Sandbank Cove over there has a star point. Deep Cove around the corner has a star point. And Thoreau's Cove. Cut stone. See these? Those are drill holes. What are they drilling them with? Well, this is done in the 20th century, probably with steam drills. Look at this. This is basically a retaining wall built to hold back the slope created by the pond path below this steep slope. This is typical of all the way around Walden, is to have a collapse slope. And when you put a pond path on an angle of repose collapse slope, guess what you're going to get? Collapse. Muskrat. Thor would be happy. You can see the party in the picture there. Okay, these are the boating at Lake Walden Amusement Park, circa 1868. We're standing here looking across at what is now the boathouse, but there was no boathouse then because that was not a popular place to come. This was the popular place to come because the railroad is right up there. And we had many cars daily, lots of facts and statistics in this book and in the Barksdale Maynard's History of Walden Pond. There's just a really, really nice story here of Ice Fort Cove. And this is where one end of Thoreau's survey line is for doing the pond, and that's where the other end of the survey line is. This is his main transect, and he runs other ones coming out of Deep Cove and then into the waterfront point. So he's got these key survey stations that we can look at, and they're all in important places. Another thing you can see here are the ripple marks. There are occasional, waves that are coming in here because this is actually kind of a nice strandline beach during storms. You can see that there's more of a water line or a beach here than there would be normally. But when there are no storms from the east, it is the quietest cove on the lake because the prevailing winds come in from the west. And so one of the reasons they ran an ice operation here is not just because the railroad was here, but because the ice froze really cleanly, okay? Because it's cold and still. If you look in this direction, you will see a straight track that is set down about 20 feet below the edge of the land. Those are artificial cuts or synthetic cuts excavated by the Irish laborers who were building the railroad. And what you can see is, where did all that material go? Well, we're going to see it at Sandbank Cove. They filled one of the coves with it to get rid of it. They used it to build causeways across other wetlands. And importantly for Walden, it was one of those cuts, one of those deep cuts, where he was inspired to write the culmination of Walden, which is that chapter in spring of the mud rivulets flowing down the sandbanks, and representing the growth of life from non-life. That there's a living power and force in nature even below the level of life. Thoreau loved and hated the train. This is the peak of the headland. The entire walk from Thoreau's Cove is you go around a headland and into a cove, and then out of the cove around the next headland and back into the cove. This is the next headland. See, the first one was between Thoreau's Cove and Icefort Cove. This one is between Icefort Cove and Sandbank. But the idea is like we're walking out and then back into the cove. These are the erosion control devices that we've been seeing all the way around Walden. My point is, they of course occur, you know, where the land is sloping down to the trail is sloping down to them from both directions, because they need to funnel water towards the pond. The really interesting thing to me is that there was no runoff at all before they cut the path, because the water simply falls in and soaks through the sand and gravel and the sandy soils. It's only because we cut the path and we trod the path that we create the surface runoff that requires this elaborate engineering. So Thoreau made jokes about trails throughout Walden, his own trails and his pathways. And this is just an example of something that he mused on quite a bit. This is what I meant by straight. Now, why is the trail straight? It's because the slope is straight. Why is the slope straight? It's because the railroad is up there, okay? And the railroad filled this bay to that level and put a track on the outer edge. But the slope from that fill went all the way down to the bottom of the cove. So it is a filled cove, and that is why this was straight. If you look at Thoreau's map of the lake, you will see that he used a straight edge to draw the crossways to this cove. One of the things that people miss about Walden is that when you turn the corner from south, east, and west facing slopes to a true north facing slope, the hemlocks and the moss just come right back. This slope is noted for luxuriant mosses and mushrooms growing, and these are really big old hemlocks. And I just really notice it every time I round the corner coming out of Sandbank Cove, you know, into the next headland. Thoreau seldom visited Deep Cove, the most isolated and hidden cove on the lake. The tip of the cove, an important groundwater boundary, was the site of a failed experiment to pump the lake down to improve swimming. But the important thing is that it looks directly across at Thoreau's Cove. A map of the lake would reveal a line from Thoreau's Cove and his house site straight across to Deep Cove. That's the bisector of the pond, to match the east-west bisector of the pond, to give the center of it as the lowest and deepest and biggest basin. Panorama offers the best view of Walden Pond by putting the pond's western and eastern basins to left and right. The stop is also the best place to compare Thoreau's 19th century landscape to the west with our 21st century landscape to the east. And it's really the broadest view of the pond. I say it's the best one because it's here. You can see the western big basin, and the second biggest basin is over there that goes down to the boat launch. So you're combining the central basin across from us with the western and the eastern, and there's this broad curve, and it gives us the best view of the lake, from my mind. Walden Pond State Reservation is an internationally acclaimed National Historic Landmark due to its association with Henry David Thoreau and his profoundly influential work, Walden or Life in the Woods. Simultaneously, the reservation is a heavily visited recreation facility as it provides a diverse set of recreational activities, including high-demand water-based activities. So there's the paradox. How do we take care of Walden? And that's a comparison of purpose. there's also a then and now comparison of what Walden was like when Thoreau was here and what it's like now, that I comment on in this section and would tour if I had people in person. I can't get enough of this place, and I can't get enough of Thoreau people either. They're just really my peeps. And so it's a pleasure to share this with you virtually. And a great shout out to Magda for putting this together. Is that okay?